The warning klaxon echoed across Edwards Air Force Base at 0347 hours, its piercing wail cutting through the desert silence like a blade. In the Pacific, Naval Strike Group Alpha was under siege, 12 ships, 4,000 sailors, and Americas. Most advanced naval technology trapped in a deadly electronic warfare web that had turned their own systems against them. 3 F-35 Lightning II missions had already failed, their billion-dollar avionics rendered useless by an enemy that had cracked every digital defense the military possessed. The Pentagon was calling it impossible. The Navy was preparing for the worst. And in a classified hangar that most officers didn't even know existed, one woman was about to prove that sometimes the impossible just needs someone willing to fly it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez felt the desert heat hit her face like a furnace door opening as she stepped from the air-conditioned transport bus onto the shimmering tarmac of Edwards Air Force Base. Her worn leather flight bag hung heavy on her shoulder, containing certificates and flight records that nobody here wanted to see. The application letter in her jacket pocket had already been returned twice, stamped with red ink that might as well have been blood. Application denied, insufficient qualifications. She'd driven 18 hours straight from her civilian flight. Instructor job in Texas, sleeping in her car at truck stops. Because this was her last shot at the dream that had consumed her since childhood. The morning sun transformed the concrete into a mirror of liquid heat, forcing her to squint as she made her way toward the recruitment building. Her boots, practical black leather worn smooth from years of walking between aircraft, made no sound that anyone noticed. Around her, the base hummed with the kind of precision that came from unlimited budgets and unlimited confidence. F-35s screamed overhead in perfect formation, their afterburners painting contrails across the cloudless sky. Ground crews in crisp uniforms moved between million-dollar aircraft with the casual efficiency of people who had never doubted they belonged. Sarah's reflection caught in the polished surface of a passing maintenance truck, and she saw what everyone else would see, a 32-year-old woman in faded jeans and a simple white button-down shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a functional ponytail that suggested practicality over style. No ribbons, no rank insignia, no evidence of the 3,000 flight hours she'd logged in everything from crop dusters to corporate jets. She looked like exactly what she was, a civilian trying to break into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. The recruitment office sat at the intersection of two massive runways, its windows reflecting the endless parade of military aircraft that represented everything Sarah wanted to be part of. She pushed through the heavy glass doors into air conditioning, so aggressive it felt like stepping into a freezer. Behind the reception desk, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez looked up with the kind of polite disinterest that government employees had perfected into an art form. Sarah placed her application packet on the desk, the papers slightly wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times. Rodriguez glanced at the cover sheet without picking it up, her eyes scanning the civilian address and absence of military service history. The pause stretched long enough for Sarah to hear the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant rumble of jets taking off. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the patient tone usually reserved for explaining things to children. "This is a military installation. Civilian flight training programs are handled through the recruiting station in town." "I'm not looking for civilian training," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. "I'm applying for active duty pilot training. I have over 3,000 hours of flight experience across 15 different aircraft types, including twin-engine and high-performance jets." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly, and she finally picked up the application. She flipped through the pages with the speed of someone looking for reasons to say no rather than yes. Sarah's logbooks, recommendation letters, and civilian flight certifications might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the consideration they received. The thing is, Rodriguez continued, setting the papers back down without reading them thoroughly, we have very specific requirements for pilot candidates. Military background, preferred age range, educational credentials from approved institutions. She gestured vaguely at a poster on the wall showing young men and women in pristine flight suits standing beside gleaming aircraft, the Air Force, Academy, our OTC programs, that sort of thing. We're not really set up to process applications from civilian instructors. The words hit Sarah like flak, each one calculated to remind her that she was an outsider trying to break into a club that had never intended to include her. She'd heard variations of this speech at 3 other bases, delivered with the same polite finality that meant the decision had been made before she'd even spoken. I understand the requirements, Sarah said, pulling a folder from her bag. I've brought documentation showing equivalency training, advanced certifications, and performance records that exceed your published standards. I've also completed preliminary medical and psychological evaluations at my own expense. Rodriguez accepted the folder with obvious reluctance, her fingers barely touching the edges as if civilian documents might contaminate her. She opened it and glanced at the top sheet, a flight evaluation form from a former Navy test pilot who had described Sarah's skills as exceptional by any standard, military or civilian. The sound of boots on tile announced the arrival of Captain Derek Walsh, a pilot whose confidence radiated from his perfectly pressed flight suit and the custom patches that marked him as part of the base's elite F-35 program. He moved with the easy swagger of someone who had never been told he didn't belong anywhere, his eyes taking in Sarah's civilian clothes and non-military bearing with immediate assessment. "Problem here, Rodriguez?" Walsh asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from rank and belonging. His gaze settled on Sarah's application packet with the same expression someone might use when finding litter on their lawn. "No problem, sir," Rodriguez replied quickly. "Just explaining our application procedures to this civilian. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Walsh picked up Sarah's folder and flipped through it with theatrical speed, his expression shifting from boredom to amusement as he read. A small crowd of junior officers had begun to gather, drawn by the novelty of a civilian trying to join their exclusive ranks. Their whispered comments carried just loud enough for Sarah to hear, "Flight instructor. Civilian hours don't count. What's next, crop dusters?" "Let me get this straight," Walsh said, addressing Sarah directly for the first time. "You think 3,000 hours of flying weekend warriors around in Cessnas qualifies you to fly military aircraft?" His voice carried the patient condescension of someone explaining why the sky was blue. "Ma'am, we fly $60 million fighters. Our training programs are designed for individuals with specific backgrounds and demonstrated capabilities under military conditions." Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the room focused on her, measuring her against their standards and finding her wanting. The air conditioning that had felt so aggressive when she'd entered now seemed insufficient against the heat of embarrassment and frustration building in her chest. "My experience includes turbine aircraft, complex aviation systems, and flight instruction under emergency conditions," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I've logged hours in weather conditions and mechanical situations that your simulator training can't replicate." Walsh's laugh was sharp and brief, a sound designed to punctuate the end of a conversation rather than continue it. He closed her folder and placed it back on Rodriguez's desk with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Look, I'm sure you're a fine pilot for what you do," he said, his tone suggesting he believed no such thing. "But military aviation is a different world. We need people who can handle split-second decisions in combat situations, who can operate systems that civilian pilots have never even seen. This isn't about discrimination, it's about reality. The group of junior officers nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of pity and amusement. Sarah realized that to them, she wasn't a qualified pilot seeking opportunity, she was entertainment, a break in their routine that would become a story they'd tell later, about the civilian woman who thought she could join the Air Force. Rodriguez had already begun sliding Sarah's application back across the desk, the gesture as final as a door closing. "I'm sorry, but we're not accepting applications from candidates without military background at this time. You might consider exploring civilian aviation opportunities that would better match your experience level." Sarah picked up her papers, the weight of rejection settling on her shoulders like a lid blanket. She'd driven across 3 states, spent her savings on documentation and medical exams, and used every connection she had to get recommendations, all to be dismissed in less than 10 minutes by people who had never seen her fly. As she turned toward the exit, Walsh called out one final comment that followed her to the door. "Hey, Rodriguez, make sure you file that under unrealistic expectations. We get a few of these every year, people who watch Top Gun too many times and think they can join the club." The laughter that followed Sarah into the desert heat was worse than the rejection itself. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, turning the tarmac into a furnace that matched the burning in her chest. She walked slowly back toward the bus stop, her flight bag feeling heavier with each step. But as she passed the restricted access roads that led to the classified sections of the base, Sarah noticed something that the recruitment officers hadn't bothered to ask about. Her civilian flight experience included 6 months as a contract instructor for defense contractors, 6 months spent learning to fly aircraft, so classified that she'd signed non-disclosure agreements that would follow her to the grave. She knew systems and capabilities that Walsh and his perfectly uniformed colleagues would never be cleared to touch. The knowledge sat quietly in her mind as the transport bus carried her away from Edwards Air Force Base, past the signs warning unauthorized personnel to stay out, past the hangars that held secrets worth more than small countries' entire military budgets. Sarah Martinez had been rejected, dismissed, and humiliated. But she hadn't been defeated. And somewhere in the classified sections of that base, in hangars that didn't officially exist, aircraft waited that might need someone exactly like her, someone who could fly without the digital dependencies that had made the new generation of pilots helpless when their technology failed. The bus rolled through the desert heat, carrying Sarah away from her dream, but toward a destiny that neither she nor the Air Force could have imagined. 3 days later, the emergency klaxon that would change everything began to wail across Edwards Air Force Base, and the same officers who had dismissed Sarah Martinez were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous threat to national security wasn't the enemy's weapons, it was their own overconfidence in technology that could be turned against them. Part 2. The crisis revealed. The secure briefing room in Mission Control Center Bravo felt like a tomb at 0400 hours, its walls lined with screens displaying maritime tracking data that painted a picture of unfolding disaster. Colonel James Harrison stood before the largest monitor, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled from 18 hours of crisis management, watching red warning indicators multiply across the Pacific Fleet Operations Zone like a spreading infection. Naval Strike Group Alpha had vanished from conventional radar 3 hours ago, their last transmission a garbled distress call about systems failures and electronic interference that defied every doctrine in the book. General Patricia Stone entered the briefing room with the measured pace of someone carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders. Her silver hair caught the glow of the emergency lighting as she surveyed the collection of exhausted officers and defense contractors who had been wrestling with an impossible problem since the crisis began. The coffee in the room had gone cold. Hours ago, replaced by the bitter taste of failure and the growing realization that America's most advanced naval force was trapped by an enemy that had turned their own technology into a weapon. "Give me the situation, Colonel," Stone said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of technical discussions and radio chatter that had become the soundtrack of their collective helplessness. Harrison gestured to the main display, where a satellite overview showed the last known position of 12 naval vessels scattered across international waters. At 2,147 hours yesterday, Strike Group Alpha reported encountering what they initially classified as routine electronic surveillance. Within 30 minutes, every digital system on every ship began experiencing coordinated failures. Navigation, communications, weapons systems, even basic radar went dark simultaneously. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Major Linda Foster, the base's leading electronic warfare specialist, stepped forward with a tablet displaying technical analysis that read like science fiction. "Sir, we're looking at a level of cyber penetration that shouldn't be possible. The enemy has somehow infiltrated hardened military networks and is using our own systems to jam our communications, redirect our weapons, and blind our sensors. Every time we attempt digital contact, they gain deeper access." Stone studied the data with the expression of someone watching a chess game where the opponent had somehow gained the ability to move twice for every move she made. "What about our F-35 response missions?" Captain Derek Walsh, still wearing the flight suit from his most recent failed mission, answered with barely controlled frustration. "3 sorties, General, each one better equipped and more advanced than the last. The Lightning IIs are completely dependent on network systems for targeting, navigation, and threat assessment. The moment we enter the operational zone, our own aircraft turn into flying bricks. The enemy is using our data links against us, feeding false information directly into our cockpits." The room fell silent except for the hum of cooling systems. Working overtime to manage the heat generated by banks of computers that had become as useful as expensive paperweights, Foster pulled up a technical schematic showing the interconnected nature of modern military systems, each component linked to every other in a web of digital dependency that had seemed like strength until it became a fatal weakness. "The problem is fundamental," Foster continued, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent countless hours fighting an enemy that existed everywhere and nowhere. Modern military aircraft are essentially flying computers. Every system, from engine management to weapons targeting, relies on digital networks that can be compromised. We've created the most advanced military in history, and the enemy has figured out how to turn that advancement into our greatest vulnerability. Stone walked to the window overlooking the main runway, where F-35 sat in perfect formation under floodlights, their stealth profiles looking simultaneously threatening and helpless. "What about alternative approaches? Older systems, analog. Backups, anything that doesn't rely on network technology?" Harrison consulted a thick manual that looked ancient compared to the tablets and screens surrounding it. "Most of our legacy aircraft have been retired or converted to training platforms. The few remaining operational units still depend on modern avionics for mission-critical functions. We've spent decades integrating everything into unified digital systems specifically to avoid the inefficiencies of older approaches." The irony was bitter as medicine that cured the disease while killing the patient. The same technological integration that had made American forces the most capable in the world had also made them completely vulnerable to an enemy that could manipulate digital systems with surgical precision. Every advantage had become a disadvantage. Every strength turned into weakness. "Sir," a communications technician called from his station across the room, his voice tight with urgency. "We're receiving another transmission from Strike Group Alpha." The main speakers crackled to life, with a voice strained by static and barely controlled desperation. "Control, This is Admiral Morrison aboard USS Nimitz. Enemy forces are using our own defensive systems to target our vessels. We have friendly fire incidents, navigation systems directing us into collision courses, and weapons platforms that won't. Respond to override commands. Request immediate assistance with any capability that doesn't rely on digital networking. The transmission cut to silence that felt heavier than sound. In the space of that quiet, everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing the potential destruction of American naval supremacy, not through superior enemy weapons or tactics, but through the exploitation of their own technological sophistication. Stone turned back to her officers with the expression of a commander who had run out of conventional options. What do we have that's completely isolated from networked systems? Something the enemy can't touch because it doesn't rely on digital integration. The question sparked a flurry of technical discussions as specialists consulted databases and maintenance records, searching for aircraft that had somehow escaped the relentless modernization that had swept through military aviation. Most leads ended in disappointment, as even the oldest operational aircraft had been fitted with modern avionics to maintain compatibility with current mission requirements. Foster looked up from her tablet with an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty. There is one possibility, General. Hangar 7 houses a modified B-2 Spirit that was used for testing analog backup systems before the program was canceled. It's equipped with manual navigation, mechanical flight controls, and targeting systems that operate independently of any network. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology, but the specific aircraft Foster mentioned had been deliberately stripped of the digital dependencies that made modern bombers so capable and so vulnerable. It was a relic of paranoid planning, designed for scenarios exactly like the one they now faced. Current operational status? Stone asked, already knowing that the answer would determine whether Naval Strike Group Alpha lived or died. Harrison pulled up maintenance records on his terminal, scrolling through technical data that painted a picture of an aircraft maintained but not actively used. Ghost Rider has been in storage for 18 months, but all systems are rated operational. The challenge is finding someone qualified to fly it using manual systems that haven't been standard in military aviation for over a decade. The room fell quiet again as the magnitude of their situation became clear. They had an aircraft that could potentially reach the fleet and operate in the electronic warfare environment that had defeated every other approach. But flying a stealth bomber using analog systems required skills and experience that the current generation of pilots had never developed. Walsh stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the solution to problems. General, I can adapt to manual systems. The F-35 program includes emergency procedures for degraded digital capability. Foster shook her head with the patience of someone explaining complex mathematics to a student who insisted that 2 + 2 = 5. Captain, respectfully, emergency procedures for partial system failure are completely different from flying an aircraft with no digital assistance whatsoever. The B-2 we're discussing requires manual navigation using charts and compass headings, visual target identification without computer assistance, and flight control inputs that depend entirely on pilot skill rather than computer augmentation. The technical requirements sounded like a description of aviation from a different century, which in many ways they were. Modern military pilots trained on systems that provided constant digital feedback, computer-assisted decision-making, and automated responses to emergency situations. Manual flying had become a backup skill rather than a primary capability. Stone studied the faces around her, seeing the uncertainty that came from confronting a problem that couldn't be solved with more technology or better training on existing systems. How long would it take to train someone to fly Ghost Rider effectively? Using only manual systems? For a qualified pilot with no experience in analog navigation and targeting? Foster consulted technical manuals that looked like archaeological artifacts. Minimum of 6 months for basic proficiency, assuming optimal learning conditions and extensive simulation time. The answer fell into the room like a stone into deep water, creating ripples of realization that they were discussing timeline. That made their solution irrelevant. Naval Strike Group Alpha didn't have 6 months. Based on current intelligence estimates, they had perhaps 6 hours before enemy forces completed whatever operation had trapped them in the electronic warfare web. Harrison moved to the communications station and opened a secure channel to Pentagon. Leadership, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news that would reshape military policy for generations. Control, this is Edwards Base Command. We have identified a potential solution for Pacific Fleet crisis, but implementation timeline exceeds operational window. Request guidance on alternative approaches. The response came back within minutes. Carrying the barely controlled panic of senior leadership, watching American naval power disappear in real time. Edwards Command, you are authorized to pursue any solution with potential for immediate deployment. Congressional oversight is suspended, budget restrictions are lifted, and operational protocols are waived until crisis resolution. The authorization meant that every constraint that normally governed military operations had been removed, leaving only the fundamental problem that they needed someone who could fly a stealth bomber, using skills that no current military pilot possessed. Stone walked back to the window and stared at the aircraft sitting under the floodlights, each one representing hundreds of millions of dollars of technology that had become useless against an enemy that fought in the digital realm. General, Foster said quietly, her voice carrying an idea that she wasn't sure she should voice. There might be someone. The words hung in the air with the weight of desperate possibility. Stone turned from the window with the expression of someone grasping for any solution, no matter how unlikely. Explain. Foster pulled up personnel records on her tablet, scrolling through databases that tracked every pilot who had ever had contact with classified programs. 3 days ago, we processed and rejected an application from a civilian pilot, Sarah Martinez. Her background includes contract work with defense contractors on classified analog systems training. She has experience with manual navigation, non-network targeting, and emergency procedures that don't rely on digital backup. The name meant nothing to most of the officers in the room, but Walsh straightened with sudden recognition. The flight instructor who applied for active duty. Foster, that woman has 0 military experience and 0 qualifications for military aviation. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely correct, Foster replied, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who had done her research thoroughly. But these aren't normal circumstances. Martinez has logged flight time in aircraft specifically designed to operate without digital networking. Her contract work included training programs for scenarios exactly like what we're facing. Stone studied Foster with the intensity of someone evaluating whether desperation had driven her team to madness or inspiration. Are you seriously suggesting that we put a civilian flight instructor in a $60 million stealth bomber and send her into a combat zone where our most advanced pilots have already failed? The question crystallized everything wrong with their situation and everything that might make it right. Foster met Stone's gaze without flinching, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. General, I'm suggesting that we find someone who can fly that aircraft using skills that our advanced pilots never learned because they never needed them. Martinez isn't qualified for modern military aviation, but modern military aviation is exactly what's failing us. Part 3. The impossible situation. The secure phone line between Edwards Air Force Base and the Pentagon carried conversations that would never appear in any official record. Voices discussing options that ranged from impossible to catastrophic. General Stone sat alone in her office at 0600 hours, staring at personnel files spread across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. Naval Strike Group Alpha had been silent for 2 hours, their last transmission. A fragmentary report about enemy forces closing distance while American defensive systems continued to malfunction in ways that defied explanation. The morning sun streaming through her window illuminated status reports that read like excerpts from science fiction. Enemy vessels appeared and disappeared from radar at will, using stolen American identification codes to penetrate defensive formations. Weapons systems fired on friendly targets while displaying green status lights. Navigation computers directed ships toward collision courses while showing safe routes on their displays. Every digital system that had made the American Navy the most powerful force in maritime history had become a weapon in enemy hands. Stone's secure tablet chimed with an incoming message from Pacific Fleet Command, its contents marked with classification levels that required her to verify her identity twice before accessing the information. Admiral Morrison's written report was clinical in its precision and terrifying in its implications. Enemy forces had demonstrated the ability to penetrate every level of American military networking, from individual weapon targeting systems to fleet-wide communications protocols. Traditional countermeasures had proven worse than useless, actually providing the enemy with deeper access to systems they were designed to protect. The implications stretched far beyond Naval Strike Group Alpha or even the immediate crisis in the Pacific. If enemy forces could penetrate American military networks this completely, then every base, every aircraft, every system that relied on digital integration was potentially compromised. The technological advantage that had dominated American military planning for decades had become a liability that threatened the foundation of national security. A soft knock on her office door interrupted Stone's review of technical reports. That grew more disturbing with each page. Major Foster entered carrying a coffee that had long since gone cold, an expression that suggested she hadn't slept in the 36 hours since the crisis began. "General, we've completed analysis of all available aircraft and pilot resources," Foster said, settling into the chair across from Stone's desk with the exhaustion of someone who had explored every conventional option and found them all wanting. "The situation is worse than our initial assessment." Stone set aside the tablet and focused on Foster with the attention of someone who knew that the next few minutes might determine whether American naval power survived the decade. "How much worse?" Foster opened her own tablet and displayed aircraft availability charts that told a story of technological dependency that had seemed like progress until it became a trap. Every operational bomber and fighter aircraft in our inventory includes digital systems that can be compromised by the same electronic warfare techniques being used against the fleet. Even our oldest F-16s have been retrofitted with modern avionics that rely on network connectivity for essential functions. The charts showed aircraft after aircraft marked with red indicators, each one representing millions of dollars of military hardware that had become useless in the face of an enemy that fought in the digital realm rather than physical space. Stone studied the data with growing understanding that American military power had been built on a foundation that was simultaneously their greatest strength and their most critical weakness. "What about the B-2 Spirit in Hangar 7? Stone asked, already knowing that Foster's research would have covered the one aircraft that might represent hope. "Ghost Rider remains our only option," Foster replied, highlighting technical specifications that read like a catalog of deliberate obsolescence. The aircraft was specifically modified to operate using analog systems as part of a research program investigating electronic warfare vulnerabilities. Every digital component was either removed or isolated from external networks. The modification history told the story of military planners who had foreseen exactly the scenario now unfolding in the Pacific. Paranoid preparation that had seemed like unnecessary expense when budget committees reviewed the program had become the only potential salvation for American naval forces strapped by their own technological sophistication. Stone leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, where acoustic tiles disguised sensors that monitored every conversation in the room for potential security breaches. Current pilot availability for manual flight operations? The question triggered a discussion that revealed the depth of American military dependence on digital systems. Foster consulted personnel databases that tracked pilot qualifications across every category of aircraft and mission profile, searching for individuals with experience in the kind of manual flying that had been standard practice before computer assistance became universal. We have 3 pilots with documented experience in manual navigation and targeting systems, Foster said, her voice carrying the disappointment of someone delivering news that solved nothing. 2 are currently deployed overseas on classified missions with estimated return dates of 6 to 8 weeks. The 3rd is Captain Walsh. The mention of Walsh brought back memories of his confident dismissal of civilian pilot capabilities and his absolute certainty that modern military training prepared him for any aviation challenge. Stone had reviewed his personnel file and found exactly what she expected: exemplary performance in every digital system, perfect scores on computer-assisted flight evaluations, and 0 experience with the kind of manual flying that Ghostwriter would require. Assessment of Walsh's capabilities for manual flight operations? Foster hesitated in the way that people do. They must deliver news that contradicts official narratives and comfortable assumptions. Captain Walsh's training record shows excellence in all areas of modern military aviation. However, his experience with manual navigation consists of brief emergency procedure training that assumes partial system functionality rather than complete analog operation. The distinction was crucial and potentially fatal. Emergency procedures trained pilots to fly without specific digital systems while relying on others for backup and support. Manual operation of Ghostwriter would require flying without any digital assistance whatsoever, using skills that hadn't been primary requirements for military pilots in over 20 years. Stone's secure phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated direct communication from Pentagon leadership. She answered with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to conversations that shaped national policy. General Stone, this is Defense Secretary Collins. What's your assessment of current options for Pacific Fleet relief? The question cut straight to the heart of their dilemma without wasting time on protocols or pleasantries. Stone glanced at Foster and made the decision to present their situation with complete honesty rather than diplomatic softening of harsh realities. Mr. Secretary, we have 1 aircraft capable of operating in the current electronic warfare environment, and insufficient pilot resources with the specialized skills required for manual operation. Our best available pilot lacks the specific experience needed for successful mission completion. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Stone to hear the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the main runway, their digital systems functioning perfectly in the controlled environment of Edwards Air Force Base, while their counterparts over the Pacific had been turned into weapons against American forces. General, I'm going to ask you a question that I never thought I'd have to ask an Air Force commander, Collins said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that conventional military thinking had failed completely. Do you have any pilot, military or otherwise, who can fly that aircraft using completely manual systems? The question opened a door that military protocols and regulations had kept firmly closed, acknowledging that desperate circumstances might require solutions that would be unthinkable under normal conditions. Stone looked at Foster, who nodded almost imperceptibly while pulling up personnel files that included civilian contractors and rejected applicants. Sir, we have 1 individual with documented experience in manual flight operations using the specific systems installed on our available aircraft. However, this person is a civilian who was recently denied military pilot training. The words felt strange leaving Stone's mouth, like suggesting that a weekend athlete could substitute for an Olympic competitor in a sport where failure meant death. But the personnel file that Foster displayed showed flight experience that directly matched the requirements for operating Ghost Rider in its current configuration. "General, let me be absolutely clear about our situation," Collins replied, his voice carrying the controlled desperation of someone watching American military superiority crumble in real time. Naval Strike Group Alpha represents $4 billion of naval assets and 4,000 American service members. Every hour of delay increases the probability of complete loss. If you have someone who can fly that mission, civilian or otherwise, you have my authorization to use whatever means necessary to make it happen. The authorization was broader than anything Stone had received in 30 years of military service, essentially suspending normal chains of command and operational procedures in favor of immediate action. She understood that Collins was giving her permission to violate regulations, ignore protocols, and take risks that would normally result in court-martial proceedings. "Understood, Mr. Secretary. We'll pursue all available options." After ending the call, Stone sat in silence for several minutes, studying Sarah Martinez's personnel file and trying to reconcile the woman who had been dismissed from the recruitment office with the pilot, whose skills might represent the only hope for Naval Strike Group Alpha. The irony was bitter as medicine that tasted terrible while saving lives. "Foster, what's your honest assessment of Martinez's capabilities?" Foster consulted technical reports and flight evaluations that painted a picture of someone whose skills had been developed outside military channels, but were directly applicable to their current needs. "General, her flight experience includes extensive manual navigation, targeting without computer assistance, and emergency procedures for complete electronic failure. Her contract work involved training scenarios designed specifically for electronic warfare environments. The qualifications were exactly what they needed, possessed by someone they had already rejected for lacking the qualifications they usually required." Stone realized that military aviation had become so specialized and technologically dependent that the skills needed for their current crisis existed primarily outside the military itself. Current location and availability? Foster had already anticipated the question and pulled up surveillance data that showed Martinez's movements since her rejection at Edwards. "She's at a civilian airfield approximately 2 hours away, conducting flight instruction for private pilots. Based on her schedule, she should be available for immediate contact." Stone stood and walked to her window where she could see aircraft that represented the pinnacle of military aviation sitting uselessly under morning sunlight. The sight crystallized everything wrong with their situation and everything that might make salvation possible. "Make the call." Part 4. The condescending dismissal. The civilian airfield outside Palmdale existed in a different world from Edwards Air Force Base, where budget constraints meant patched runways and aircraft held together by determination rather than unlimited defense spending. Sarah Martinez stood beside a weathered Cessna 172, explaining crosswind landing techniques to a nervous student pilot whose white knuckles gripped the yoke like a lifeline. The morning heat was already building toward another scorching desert day, and her simple flight instructor uniform of khaki pants and a polo shirt felt more practical than the crisp military uniform she'd been surrounded by 3 days earlier. Her student, a middle-aged accountant named Frank, who had decided to pursue his childhood dream of flight, struggled with the concept that flying an aircraft required feeling as much as technique. The digital instruments in front of him provided precise numerical data about airspeed, altitude, and heading, but they couldn't teach him how to sense the subtle changes in wind direction that meant the difference between a smooth landing and a dangerous one. "The instruments will tell you what's happening," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had taught hundreds of people to fly. "But they can't tell you what's about to happen. You need to feel the aircraft moving through the air, understand how it responds to control inputs, and develop instincts that work when the technology fails. Frank nodded with the earnest attention of someone trying to absorb lessons that challenged everything he believed about modern aviation. His background in accounting had taught him to trust numbers and data, making it difficult to accept that successful flying often required ignoring instruments in favor of sensory input that couldn't be quantified. Sarah's phone rang with the specific tone she'd assigned to unknown numbers, usually telemarketers or people calling about aircraft for sale. She almost ignored it while focusing on Frank's next attempt at crosswind landing, but something about the timing felt different. The call came through a number she didn't recognize, with an area code that suggested official business. Martinez flight instruction, this is Sarah. The voice that responded carried the clipped efficiency of military communications, immediately transporting her back to the rejection and humiliation she'd experienced at Edwards Air Force Base. Ms. Martinez, this is Major Foster from Edwards Air Force Base. I need to speak with you immediately regarding a matter of national security. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with the familiar knot of anticipation and dread that accompanied any contact with military personnel. Her first instinct was to assume that someone had reviewed her application and found additional reasons to reject her, perhaps questioning her security clearance or challenging her flight experience claims. Major, if this is about my pilot training application, I received your decision. I'm not interested in discussing alternative programs or civilian contractor positions. Foster's response came quickly, with an urgency that cut through Sarah's defensive assumptions. Ms. Martinez, this is not about your application. We have a developing situation that requires your specific skills and experience with analog flight systems. I need you to come to Edwards immediately. The words seemed to come from an alternate reality where military personnel sought civilian expertise rather than dismissing it. Sarah glanced at Frank, who was pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word of a conversation that suggested his flight instructor might be more qualified than either of them had realized. Major, I think there might be some confusion. 3 days ago, your recruitment office made it very clear that my qualifications don't meet Air Force standards. Captain Walsh specifically explained that civilian experience doesn't translate to military aviation. Foster's pause lasted long enough for Sarah to hear background noise that suggested a busy command center dealing with some kind of emergency. When she resumed speaking, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood that protocols and normal procedures had become irrelevant. Ms. Martinez, circumstances have changed dramatically since your recruitment interview. We have a situation where traditional military aviation capabilities have proven insufficient, and we need someone with your specific background in manual flight operations. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities that ranged from elaborate practical jokes to genuine emergency situations that might require skills she'd developed through years of flying aircraft that couldn't afford the latest digital technology. Her contract work with defense contractors had included scenarios that seemed like paranoid fiction at the time, but were apparently becoming reality. What kind of situation requires civilian flight instruction experience? Foster's answer came with the careful precision of someone discussing classified information over an unsecured line. I can't provide specifics over the phone, but I can tell you that we have American forces in immediate danger, and conventional approaches have failed. Your background includes experience with systems and procedures that our current pilots haven't trained on. The irony was almost overwhelming. The same military establishment that had rejected her for lacking proper qualifications was now seeking her help because she possessed qualifications they'd never bothered to ask about. Sarah realized that her dismissal had been based on assumptions about what military aviation required rather than investigation of what she could actually do. Major, assuming this is legitimate, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to come to Edwards Air Force Base immediately for a briefing on a situation that requires your specific skills. Transportation will be provided, and you'll be compensated for your time, regardless of whether you decide to participate. Sarah looked around the civilian airfield, where she'd built a modest career teaching people to fly aircraft that were decades older than anything the Air Force would consider operational. The contrast between her simple surroundings and the sophisticated military base she'd been rejected from 3 days earlier made the phone call feel like a dream sequence. "Give me 30 minutes to arrange coverage for my students," she said, already knowing that she had to find out whether this was genuine opportunity or elaborate mistake. After ending the call, Sarah explained to Frank that they'd have to reschedule his lesson due to an unexpected emergency. His disappointment was obvious, but he nodded with understanding that suggested he knew more about the importance of Sarah's work than either of them had discussed. The drive to Edwards Air Force Base felt completely different from her journey 3 days earlier. Instead of arriving as a hopeful applicant with everything to prove, she was coming as someone whose expertise was apparently needed by the same people who had dismissed her. The change in perspective made the desert landscape look different, less hostile and more like familiar territory where she belonged. The guard at the main gate checked her identification against a list that confirmed her expected arrival, directing her to a different building than the recruitment office where she'd been rejected. The efficiency of the process suggested that whatever situation had prompted the call was being treated with genuine urgency rather than bureaucratic routine. Major Foster met her at the entrance to Mission Control Center Bravo, looking like someone who had been awake for too many hours dealing with problems that defied conventional solutions. Her greeting was professional, but carried none of the dismissive politeness that Sarah had experienced during her recruitment interview. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming on short notice. Before we proceed with any briefing, I need to confirm your experience with manual navigation and analog targeting systems." Sarah followed Foster through corridors lined with security warnings and classification notices that suggested they were entering areas where casual visitors were never permitted. The questions about her background were more detailed and specific than anything she'd been asked during her application process. "My contract work with Northrop included training scenarios for electronic warfare environments where digital systems are compromised or unavailable," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the confidence that came from discussing skills she'd actually used rather than theoretical qualifications. "I have experience with manual navigation using charts and compass, headings, visual targeting without computer assistance, and flight operations that don't rely on any networked systems." Foster nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose research had been confirmed by direct investigation. They reached a secure briefing room where Sarah was asked to sign non-disclosure agreements that made her previous security clearances look like library cards. "Ms. Martinez, what I'm about to show you is classified at levels that require congressional oversight under normal circumstances. Current circumstances are not normal." The main screen displayed a map of the Pacific Ocean marked with red indicators that showed the last known positions of Naval Strike Group Alpha, surrounded by threat symbols that suggested they were trapped in a situation that conventional military responses couldn't address. Foster's briefing was clinical and precise, explaining electronic warfare capabilities that turned American technological advantages into critical vulnerabilities. "Every aircraft we've sent to assist the fleet has been compromised by enemy systems that penetrate our digital networks and turn our own technology against us," Foster continued, her voice carrying the frustration of someone watching superior military capabilities become useless. "We need someone who can operate completely outside network systems, using skills that our current pilots haven't developed." Sarah studied the tactical display with growing understanding of why her civilian experience had suddenly become valuable to people who had dismissed her days earlier. The same technological sophistication that made modern military aircraft so capable also made them vulnerable to enemies who fought in the digital realm rather than physical space. "You're looking for someone who can fly old school," Sarah said, using terminology that felt strange in the context of billion-dollar stealth bombers and national security crises. "Exactly. We have one aircraft that's been modified to operate using completely analog systems, but we need a pilot with experience in manual flight operations that don't rely on digital assistance." The irony was complete. Military aviation had become so technologically advanced that the skills needed to operate their most sophisticated aircraft in the current crisis existed primarily among civilian pilots who flew older aircraft because they couldn't afford modern systems. Sarah realized that her rejection had been based on assumptions about what qualified someone for military aviation rather than understanding of what military aviation might actually require. But even as she processed the technical requirements and strategic implications, Sarah couldn't forget the dismissive laughter that had followed her out of the recruitment office 3 days earlier. Captain Walsh's condescending explanation about military aviation being a different world echoed in her memory, along with the suggestion that she file her application under unrealistic expectations. "Major, I appreciate the briefing and the apparent change in assessment of my qualifications," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words to avoid burning bridges while addressing the obvious contradiction. "But 3 days ago, your colleagues made it very clear that civilian experience doesn't translate to military capabilities. What's changed besides the nature of your current problem?" Foster's expression acknowledged the uncomfortable truth that Sarah's question raised. "Ms. Martinez, I'll be honest with you. Nothing has changed about your qualifications or our normal assessment criteria. What's changed is that normal criteria have proven irrelevant to our current needs." The admission was as close to an apology as Sarah was likely to receive from military personnel who had been trained never to admit mistakes or uncertainty. But it also highlighted the fundamental problem with institutions that became so specialized. They lost the ability to recognize valuable skills that existed outside their established frameworks. "I need to speak with General Stone before making any decisions," Sarah said, understanding that whatever happened next would require authorization from someone with the authority to override the regulations and protocols that had governed her rejection. Part 5. The Desperate Impasse. General Stone's office felt like the center of a storm that was reshaping American military strategy in real time, with secure phone lines carrying conversations between the Pentagon, Pacific Fleet Command, and Defense. Contractors who were being asked to solve problems that their most advanced technology had created. Sarah sat across from Stone's desk, studying the same tactical displays that showed Naval Strike Group Alpha's deteriorating situation while understanding that her presence represented either desperate improvisation or inspired adaptation to circumstances that no one had anticipated. The secure briefing that Stone provided was more comprehensive than anything Sarah had expected, revealing the full scope of an electronic warfare campaign that had neutralized American naval power through the exploitation of technological dependencies that military planners had never considered vulnerabilities. Enemy forces hadn't defeated American ships through superior weapons or tactics, but by turning American advantages into weaknesses with surgical precision. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to explain our situation with complete honesty because anything less would be a disservice to you and to the people who need our help," Stone began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 30 years in military leadership and never faced a crisis that defied conventional solutions. "We have 12 ships and 4,000 sailors trapped in an electronic warfare environment that has defeated every conventional response we've attempted." Sarah studied the technical data that showed how enemy forces had penetrated American military networks at levels that seemed impossible given the security measures she knew were standard for classified systems. The enemy hadn't broken American encryption or overcome American defenses through brute force attacks, but had somehow gained access to the foundational systems that everything else depended upon. How was this level of penetration possible? Sarah asked, her background in civilian aviation providing perspective that military specialists might miss. Even commercial aircraft have isolated systems that can't be accessed through external networks. Stone gestured to displays showing the interconnected nature of modern military technology, where every system was linked to every other system in ways that created efficiency under normal circumstances and catastrophic vulnerability. When those connections were exploited, military integration goes far beyond commercial aviation. Our aircraft, ships, and weapon systems share data in real time to create tactical advantages that require constant networking. The explanation revealed the fundamental difference between civilian and military aviation that went far beyond training requirements or qualification standards. Civilian aircraft were designed with redundancy and isolation that prioritized safety over performance, while military aircraft prioritized capability through integration that assumed friendly control of the networking environment. Sarah realized that her experience with older civilian aircraft had provided her with skills that modern military pilots had never needed to develop, because their technology had eliminated the requirement for manual capabilities. The same advancement that made military aviation so capable had also made it completely dependent on systems that could be turned against them. "General, I understand the technical requirements and the strategic situation," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully to address both the opportunity and the obvious problems with their proposed solution. "But I need to understand the command structure and operational authority for whatever mission you're considering." Stone's expression acknowledged the complexity of a situation that required improvising solutions while maintaining military discipline and legal authority. "Ms. Martinez, I have direct authorization from the Secretary of Defense to pursue any approach that might resolve this crisis. That authorization supersedes normal recruitment procedures, training requirements, and operational protocols." The scope of the authorization was broader than anything Sarah had imagined possible within military structure, essentially suspending the regulations that had governed her rejection while creating authority that didn't normally exist for civilian involvement in combat operations. She understood that Stone was offering her the opportunity to participate in operations that would normally require years of military training and security clearances. But even with unlimited authorization and desperate circumstances, Sarah couldn't ignore the practical problems that made their situation almost impossible, regardless of her technical qualifications. The aircraft they wanted her to fly was a B-2 Spirit stealth bomber worth $60 million, designed for missions that required precision and reliability that could determine the outcome of international conflicts. "General, assuming I have the technical skills for manual operation of your aircraft, I have zero experience with military mission planning, combat procedures, or operations in hostile environments," Sarah said, stating the obvious problems that authorization couldn't solve. Flying the aircraft is only part of what would be required for successful mission completion. Stone nodded with the acknowledgement of someone who understood that technical capability was necessary but not sufficient for the kind of mission they were contemplating. "Ms. Martinez, we're not asking you to plan the mission or make tactical decisions. We have navigation specialists who can provide precise coordinates, target identification specialists who can guide your approach, and tactical coordinators who can manage the overall operation. What we need from you is the ability to fly that aircraft to the target zone and deliver the payload, using systems that can't be compromised by enemy interference." Sarah absorbed the explanation while studying tactical maps that showed approach routes through international airspace toward the zone where Naval Strike Group Alpha was trapped. The mission profile was complex but not impossible, requiring precision flying rather than combat decision-making that she wasn't qualified to handle. "What's the specific payload and delivery method?" Sarah asked, understanding that the success of any bombing mission depended as much on accurate delivery a successful navigation to the target area. Stone activated a secure display that showed technical specifications for specialized equipment that had been designed specifically for the electronic warfare environment they were facing. Electronic countermeasure devices that will disrupt enemy systems long enough for the fleet to restore their own capabilities and break free from the interference web. The payload wasn't designed to destroy enemy forces through explosive damage, but to create electronic interference that would give American systems time to recover and re-establish normal operations. Sarah understood that the mission was more about technical precision than combat effectiveness, requiring her to deliver equipment to specific coordinates with timing that could determine whether the fleet escaped or was destroyed. Delivery accuracy requirements within 50 meters of designated coordinates, with timing synchronized to fleet movements that will begin when you reach the release point, Stone replied, consulting technical data that showed the narrow margins for error that would determine mission success or failure. Sarah studied the requirements with growing confidence that the mission was within her capabilities, despite being far more complex than anything she'd attempted during her civilian career. The precision flying required was similar to what she'd practiced during her contract work, and the manual navigation would rely on skills she'd maintained even when digital systems made them technically unnecessary. But one critical question remained unanswered, and Sarah knew that addressing it would determine whether she could commit to a mission that might save 4,000 American lives or result in her own death, along with the loss of a $60 million aircraft. "General, I need to know about Captain Walsh's role in this operation." Stone's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging a personnel issue that she'd been hoping to avoid discussing until after Sarah had committed to the mission. "Captain Walsh has been designated as mission commander and will provide tactical oversight during the operation." The answer struck Sarah like cold water, immediately raising concerns about command authority and operational effectiveness that went far beyond technical requirements or mission planning. Walsh was the same officer who had dismissed her qualifications 3 days earlier, suggesting that civilian pilots lacked the skills for military aviation and recommending that her application be filed under unrealistic expectations. "General, with respect, Captain Walsh made it very clear during my recruitment interview that he considers civilian aviation experience irrelevant to military operations," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the frustration that came from contemplating a mission where she would be taking orders from someone who had publicly ridiculed her capabilities. Stone leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who understood that personnel conflicts could destroy mission effectiveness, regardless of technical capabilities or strategic necessity. "Ms. Martinez, Captain Walsh's assessment was based on normal operational requirements that don't apply to our current situation. His role as mission commander reflects his experience with military procedures rather than evaluation of your piloting abilities." The explanation was diplomatically phrased, but couldn't hide the fundamental problem that Sarah would be flying the most important mission of her life under the command of someone who had already demonstrated contempt for her qualifications. She realized that succeeding would require not only technical competence, but also the ability to work effectively with military personnel, who viewed her presence as evidence of institutional desperation rather than recognition of valuable skills. "I need to speak with Captain Walsh before making any final decision about participation," Sarah said, understanding that the conversation would be uncomfortable, but necessary for determining whether effective cooperation was possible. Stone picked up her secure phone and issued brief instructions that resulted in Walsh appearing at her office within minutes, still wearing the flight suit that had become his uniform during the extended crisis. His expression upon seeing Sarah suggested that he viewed her presence as confirmation that military leadership had lost perspective on realistic solutions to their problems. "General, I understand we're exploring unconventional approaches to the Pacific situation, Walsh said, his voice carrying the controlled patience of someone addressing decisions he couldn't openly criticize. "But I have serious concerns about operational security and mission effectiveness when involving civilian personnel in classified operations." Sarah listened to Walsh's objections with growing understanding that his resistance wasn't based on personal animosity but on genuine concerns about mixing civilian capabilities with military requirements. His training and experience had taught him that successful operations required standardized procedures and qualified personnel working within established frameworks. "Captain, I share your concerns about operational effectiveness," Sarah replied, choosing her words to address his professional worries rather than defend against personal slights. "But I also understand that conventional approaches have failed, and this mission requires capabilities that exist outside normal military training." Walsh studied Sarah with the expression of someone reassessing initial impressions based on new information and changed circumstances. His dismissal of her qualifications 3 days earlier had been based on assumptions about what military aviation required under normal conditions, but normal conditions no longer applied to their situation. "Ms. Martinez, assuming you have the technical skills for manual operation of the B-2, are you prepared to follow military command structure and operational procedures during a combat mission?" Walsh asked, his question addressing the practical requirements for effective cooperation rather than challenging her fundamental qualifications. "Captain, I'm prepared to follow lawful orders and work within established procedures, provided that those procedures don't contradict the technical requirements for safe aircraft operation," Sarah answered, establishing boundaries that protected her responsibility as pilot while acknowledging his authority as mission commander. The exchange established a foundation for professional cooperation that neither of them had expected when Sarah first applied for military pilot training. Walsh's expertise in military procedures complemented Sarah's technical skills for manual flying, creating potential for mission effectiveness that relied on both of their capabilities. Stone observed the interaction with satisfaction that came from watching potential conflicts resolve into functional working relationships. "Captain Walsh, Ms. Martinez will serve as pilot for the Ghost Rider mission under your tactical command. Mission briefing begins in 30 minutes, with launch scheduled for 1400 hours. The timeline was aggressive, but necessary given the deteriorating situation with Naval Strike Group Alpha, whose silence over the past 4 hours suggested that their circumstances were becoming increasingly desperate. Sarah realized that she had less than 6 hours to prepare for the most important flight of her life, using an aircraft she'd never seen to deliver a payload that could determine the fate of American naval power in the Pacific. "General, I'll need time to familiarize myself with the aircraft systems and review the mission profile," Sarah said, understanding that successful completion would require thorough preparation despite the compressed timeline. "Technical briefing begins immediately, followed by aircraft inspection and systems check," Stone replied, activating communication systems that would connect Sarah with specialists who could provide detailed information about Ghost Rider's unique configuration. As Sarah left Stone's office to begin preparation for a mission that would have been impossible to imagine a week earlier, she reflected on the series of events that had transformed her from rejected applicant to essential participant in a national security crisis. The same qualifications that had been dismissed as insufficient for military aviation had become exactly what military aviation needed when conventional approaches failed. The irony was complete, but no longer bitter. Sarah Martinez was about to prove that sometimes the most important qualifications for military service existed outside military institutions, and that expertise developed through civilian experience could be just as valuable as credentials earned through traditional channels. The technical briefing took place in a secure conference room where aerospace engineers and military specialists provided Sarah with detailed information about Ghost Rider's analog systems and manual operation procedures. The aircraft had been Modified so extensively that flying it resembled operating vintage aircraft more than modern stealth bombers, requiring skills that current military pilots had never needed to develop. Sarah studied system diagrams that showed mechanical linkages where other aircraft used electronic connections, manual gauges where others relied on digital displays, and navigation equipment that hadn't been standard in military aviation for over 20 years. The modifications had been designed by engineers who understood that electronic sophistication created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies with sufficient technical capability. The flight control system uses direct mechanical linkages with hydraulic assistance, but no computer augmentation, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead engineer who had supervised Ghost Rider's conversion to analog operation. Control inputs are transmitted directly to flight surfaces without any electronic filtering or stability assistance. The lack of computer assistance meant that Sarah would be responsible for maintaining aircraft stability through manual control inputs rather than relying on automated systems that corrected for pilot error or environmental disturbances. Flying Ghost Rider would require constant attention and precise technique that left no room for the kind of mistakes that modern aircraft were designed to compensate for automatically. Navigation uses inertial guidance with manual updates based on visual references and radio beacon triangulation. Dr. Walsh continued, showing Sarah equipment that looked like museum displays compared to the GPS and satellite systems that modern pilots took for granted. Route planning must account for dead reckoning, navigation with periodic position corrections using landmarks and coastal features. Sarah nodded with recognition that came from flying aircraft where navigation required skill and preparation, rather than simply programming coordinates into computer systems. Her experience with manual navigation would be essential for reaching the target zone, but the precision required for successful payload delivery would challenge every technique she'd developed during her civilian career. The payload briefing revealed technology that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more primitive than anything Sarah had expected. The electronic countermeasure devices were cutting-edge equipment designed to disrupt enemy systems, but their delivery required manual targeting procedures that hadn't been used in military operations for decades. Release must occur at specific coordinates with precise timing synchronized to fleet movements, explained Major Thomas Rivera, the mission planning specialist who had calculated approach routes and delivery parameters. The countermeasure devices will create electromagnetic interference that disrupts enemy systems for approximately 12 minutes, providing the fleet with opportunity to restore their own capabilities. The narrow window for success meant that Sarah's flying would need to be precise to tolerances that left no margin for error. Arriving at the release point even 30 seconds early or late could result in mission failure and the continued entrapment of Naval Strike Group Alpha in the electronic warfare web that had already defeated 3 conventional rescue attempts. Weather conditions and wind patterns for the target zone? Sarah asked, understanding that manual flying required accounting for environmental factors that computer-assisted aircraft handled automatically. Rivera consulted meteorological data that painted a picture of challenging but manageable conditions for manual flight operations. Crosswinds at 15 to 20 knots, visibility reduced by scattered clouds, and thermal turbulence from ocean temperature variations. Conditions are within acceptable parameters for experienced manual pilots. Sarah studied the weather information with growing confidence that the mission was achievable despite its complexity and risk. The environmental challenges were similar to conditions she'd encountered during civilian flying, and her experience with crosswind navigation would be essential for accurate payload delivery in the unstable air over the Pacific. But even with thorough technical preparation and favorable weather conditions, Sarah understood that mission success would ultimately depend on her ability to fly with precision that exceeded anything she'd attempted during her civilian career. The stakes were higher than any training scenario or civilian emergency, with the lives of 4,000 sailors depending on her ability to deliver equipment to coordinates that she'd never seen using navigation techniques that most modern pilots had never learned. The final element of mission preparation involved security briefings that revealed classified information about enemy capabilities and American response strategies that would reshape her understanding of international relations and military planning. Sarah learned that the electronic warfare campaign against Naval Strike Group Alpha was part of a broader testing of American military vulnerabilities that had implications far beyond the immediate crisis in the Pacific. Enemy forces are evaluating the effectiveness of cyber warfare against American military systems, explained Colonel Harrison, the intelligence specialist who briefed Sarah on classified threat assessments. Success in neutralizing our naval forces would encourage similar attacks against other military units and potentially civilian infrastructure. The broader implications meant that Sarah's mission was about more than rescuing Naval Strike Group Alpha, though saving 4,000 American lives was justification enough for any risk or effort. Success would also demonstrate American resilience and adaptability in the face of technological warfare that threatened to make conventional military superiority irrelevant. Failure analysis for previous rescue attempts. Sarah asked, wanting to understand why conventional approaches had been unsuccessful so she could avoid making similar mistakes. Harrison displayed tactical data showing how F-35 missions had been compromised by enemy penetration of their digital systems, turning American aircraft into sources of intelligence for the same forces they were trying to combat. Each conventional approach provided the enemy with additional access to our systems and deeper understanding of our capabilities. Sarah realized that her mission's greatest advantage was also its greatest vulnerability to different kinds of failure. Ghost Rider's analog systems made it immune to the electronic warfare that had defeated other aircraft, but manual operation created possibilities for human error that computer-assisted flying was designed to prevent. The final technical briefing covered emergency procedures for mechanical failure, enemy contact, and abort scenarios that might require Sarah to make life or death decisions without guidance from ground control or mission command. Flying Ghost Rider into a combat zone meant accepting responsibility for choices that could determine not only her own survival but the success of a mission that had national security implications. Communication with ground control will be limited to predetermined check-in points using radio frequencies that change according to established schedules, Harrison explained, showing Sarah communication protocols that balanced operational security with mission coordination requirements. Most of the flight will be conducted under radio silence to avoid providing enemy forces with electronic signatures they can track or exploit. The isolation meant that Sarah would be flying most of the mission without external guidance or support, relying on her own navigation skills and judgment to reach the target zone and deliver the payload with precision that could save or doom the fleet. The responsibility was overwhelming, but also familiar from civilian flying, where pilots routinely operated without constant ground control contact or computer assistance. As the technical briefings concluded and Sarah prepared for her first inspection of Ghost Rider itself, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 hours. She'd entered Edwards Air Force Base as a civilian flight instructor whose qualifications had been dismissed as inadequate for military service and was now preparing to fly the most important mission in current American military operations. The change wasn't just in military perception of her capabilities, but in her own understanding of how skills developed outside conventional institutions could become essential when conventional approaches failed. Sarah Martinez was about to demonstrate that expertise came in many forms, and that sometimes the most valuable qualifications were the ones that traditional systems never thought to require. Hangar 7 existed in a realm of perpetual twilight, its massive doors sealed against both desert heat and unauthorized observation. Sarah Martinez stepped into the cavernous space where Ghost Rider waited like a sleeping predator, its angular surfaces absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber possessed an otherworldly beauty that made conventional aircraft look crude by comparison. But this particular example bore the subtle modifications that transformed it from digital marvel into analog instrument of precision. Sarah approached the aircraft with the reverence that all pilots felt when encountering machines that represented the pinnacle of aerospace engineering. Ghost Rider's skin was darker than standard B-2 South, coated with materials that absorbed electromagnetic radiation across spectrums that enemy sensors couldn't detect. But beneath the exotic exterior lay systems that would have been familiar to pilots from decades past. Mechanical connections and analog gauges that represented deliberate regression in service of operational security. Chief Master Sergeant Robert Kim emerged from beneath the aircraft, carrying a maintenance checklist that chronicled every modification made during Ghost Rider's conversion to manual operation. His weathered hands showed the stains and calluses that came from 30 years of working on aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was mechanically possible. And his expression carried the mixture of pride and concern that came from preparing equipment for missions where failure meant death. "Ma'am, this bird's been waiting for someone who could appreciate what she really is," Kim said, his voice carrying the affection that experienced mechanics felt for aircraft that had been entrusted to their care. Most pilots today wouldn't know what to do with manual trim tabs and mechanical engine controls. But Ghost Rider was built for someone who understands that flying is about more than programming computers. Sarah ran her hand along the aircraft's leading edge, feeling the precision of manufacturing that created surfaces smooth enough to slip through radar detection, while strong enough to withstand the stresses of supersonic flight. The tactile connection between pilot and machine was something that digital interfaces had largely eliminated. But manual operation of Ghost Rider would require constant physical awareness of how the aircraft responded to control inputs. "Walk me through the modifications," Sarah requested, understanding that her life would depend on intimate knowledge of systems that differed significantly from both civilian aircraft and standard military bombers. Kim led her through a comprehensive inspection that revealed the extent of Ghost Rider's transformation from networked weapons platform to standalone aircraft capable of independent operation. Every digital system had been either removed or isolated from external connections, replaced with analog alternatives that performed the same functions without vulnerability to electronic interference. Flight controls use direct hydraulic linkages with mechanical backup systems, Kim explained, demonstrating control surfaces that moved in response to manual inputs rather than computer commands. No fly-by-wire assistance, no stability augmentation. Just pilot skill and aircraft design working together the way they did before computers took over flying. The absence of computer assistance meant that Sarah would be responsible for maintaining aircraft stability through constant control inputs, rather than relying on automated systems that corrected for environmental disturbances or pilot error. Flying Ghost Rider would require the kind of hands-on piloting that modern military aviators rarely experienced, demanding skills that she'd maintained through years of flying older civilian aircraft. Engine management is completely manual with analog gauges for all parameters, Kim continued, showing Sarah instruments that displayed engine performance through mechanical needles rather than digital readouts. Temperature, pressure, fuel flow, everything needs to be monitored and adjusted by hand. The engines will do exactly what you tell them to do, nothing more and nothing less. Sarah studied the engine controls with growing appreciation for the complexity of manual bomber operation. Managing 4 turbofan engines without computer assistance would require constant attention to performance parameters that automated systems normally handled without pilot intervention. The responsibility was daunting, but also familiar from her experience with aircraft where pilot skill determined operational effectiveness. The navigation system represented the most dramatic departure from modern military standards, using inertial guidance updated through visual references and radio beacon, triangulation rather than GPS satellites that could be jammed or spoofed by enemy forces. Sarah examined charts and plotting tools that hadn't been standard equipment in military aircraft for over 20 years. Dead reckoning navigation with periodic position fixes using landmarks and coastal features, Kim explained. Spreading navigation charts that showed approach routes to the target zone marked with manual calculations rather than computer-generated waypoints. The inertial guidance system will give you heading and distance estimates, but accuracy depends on your ability to identify reference points and correct for drift. Sarah traced the planned route with her finger, calculating headings and distances, using techniques that she'd learned during civilian flight training, but rarely needed to use when GPS made navigation automatic. The precision required for successful payload delivery would challenge every navigation skill she'd developed, requiring her to fly precisely calculated courses over hundreds of miles of open ocean. The weapons bay housed electronic countermeasure devices that looked like oversized torpedoes, their surfaces covered with antennas and sensors designed to disrupt enemy systems across multiple electromagnetic spectrums. But delivering these sophisticated devices would require manual bombing procedures that hadn't been used in combat operations since analog computers were cutting-edge technology. Release timing must be synchronized to fleet movements with accuracy measured in seconds rather than minutes, Kim said, showing Sarah targeting equipment that required visual identification of release points rather than GPS coordinates programmed into computer systems. The countermeasure devices will create electromagnetic interference that gives the fleet 12 minutes to restore their own systems and break free from enemy control. Sarah studied the targeting procedures with growing understanding of how manual bombing required skills that computer-assisted systems had made obsolete. Success would depend on her ability to identify the correct release point through visual navigation and deliver the payload with timing that left no margin for error. Captain Walsh joined them for the final systems check, his expression showing the transformation from skeptical authority figure to professional colleague that had occurred during their mission briefing. His expertise in military procedures complemented Sarah's technical skills for manual operation, creating potential for effective cooperation that neither of them had anticipated. Flight plan calls for low-altitude approach to avoid enemy radar detection, followed by climb to release altitude timed with fleet breakout maneuvers, Walsh explained, reviewing tactical procedures that balanced stealth requirements with delivery accuracy. Radio silence except for predetermined check-in points, with abort protocols if enemy forces detect the approach. Sarah absorbed the tactical information while maintaining focus on the technical requirements that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed. Military procedures provided the framework for the operation, but manual flying would determine whether Ghost Rider reached the target zone and delivered its payload with the precision that naval rescue required. The pre-flight inspection revealed an aircraft maintained to standards that exceeded anything Sarah had experienced in civilian aviation. Every system showed evidence of meticulous care and attention to detail that reflected the importance of the mission and the value of equipment that represented decades of aerospace development. Fuel load calculated for mission profile with 30 minutes reserve, Kim reported, completing checks that confirmed Ghost Rider's readiness for the most important flight in its operational history. All systems showing green across analog indicators with manual backup procedures tested and verified. Sarah climbed into the cockpit where analog gauges and mechanical controls created an environment that felt simultaneously ancient and sophisticated. The absence of digital displays and computer interfaces made the cockpit feel sparse compared to modern aircraft, but every instrument and control had been positioned for optimal access during manual flight operations. She began the startup sequence, using procedures that required her to monitor engine parameters through direct observation rather than automated systems that provided warnings and corrections. Each engine came alive with the distinctive whine of turbofans spooling up, their performance displayed through needle indicators that required interpretation rather than digital precision. Ghost Rider, this is Edwards Tower. You are cleared for taxi to runway Charlie 9. Came the radio call that initiated the final phase of mission preparation. Sarah acknowledged the clearance while beginning the taxi procedures that would take Ghost Rider from its hangar to the runway, where the most important takeoff of her life would begin. The aircraft moved with the ponderous grace of something designed for precision rather than speed, its weight and size requiring careful attention to ground handling procedures. The taxi to the runway provided Sarah with her first opportunity to experience Ghost Rider's manual flight characteristics under actual operating conditions. The aircraft responded to control inputs with the immediate feedback that came from direct mechanical connections, requiring constant adjustments to maintain direction and speed rather than relying on automated systems that handled ground operations. At the runway threshold, Sarah completed final checks while understanding that the next few hours would determine whether her civilian qualifications were sufficient for military operations that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. The mission would test every skill she'd developed and require precision that exceeded anything she'd attempted during her civilian career. Ghost Rider, you are cleared for takeoff. Wings light and variable. Good luck. Came the final transmission from Edwards Tower, as Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt 4 massive engines respond with thrust that pressed her back into the pilot's seat. The takeoff roll seemed to last forever as Ghost Rider built speed slowly but steadily, its weight requiring almost the entire runway before reaching the velocity needed for flight. Sarah felt the aircraft become airborne with the subtle change in vibration that indicated transition from ground vehicle to flying machine, beginning a journey that would either vindicate her qualifications or prove that military aviation required capabilities she didn't possess. The initial climb was conducted under radio silence, with Sarah navigating by visual references and inertial guidance that required constant attention to heading and altitude. The Southern California coastline passed beneath Ghost Rider as the aircraft climbed toward cruise altitude, beginning a flight path that would take them over hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean toward a rendezvous with history. Sarah settled into the rhythm of manual flying that required constant attention to aircraft performance and environmental conditions. Every control input generated immediate feedback through the aircraft's mechanical systems, creating a connection between pilot and machine that digital interfaces had largely eliminated from modern aviation. The navigation required periodic position fixes using coastal landmarks and radio beacon triangulation, demanding skills that Sarah had maintained through civilian flying but rarely needed to use when GPS made navigation automatic. Each position fix confirmed that Ghost Rider was tracking toward the target zone with accuracy that would be essential for successful payload delivery. As the California coast fell behind and Ghost Rider continued westward over the Pacific, Sarah reflected on the series of events that had transformed her from rejected applicant to pilot of the most critical mission in current American military operations. The same qualifications that had been dismissed as inadequate for military service were now being tested under conditions that would determine the fate of 4,000 sailors and the future of American naval power. The flight continued through airspace that looked empty but was monitored by sensors that could detect conventional aircraft from hundreds of miles away. Ghost Rider's stealth characteristics provided protection from detection, but manual operation required Sarah to maintain precise flight parameters that kept the aircraft within its stealth envelope. Hours passed in the focused concentration that manual flying demanded, with Sarah monitoring engine performance, adjusting course headings, and calculating navigation fixes that confirmed their progress toward the target zone. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional cloud formations that provided visual references for navigation. The first indication of approaching the operational area came through electronic sensors that detected the electromagnetic interference surrounding Naval Strike Group Alpha. Sarah's instruments began showing the effects of enemy jamming, but Ghost Rider's analog systems remained unaffected by the electronic warfare that had defeated every previous rescue attempt. Approaching target zone. Prepare for payload delivery sequence. Sarah transmitted on the predetermined frequency, breaking radio silence for the first time since takeoff to coordinate with fleet movements that would begin when she reached the release point. The final approach required visual identification of the release coordinates using landmarks that were barely visible through scattered clouds and atmospheric haze. Sarah descended to the altitude calculated for optimal countermeasure deployment, while maintaining the precise heading that would position Ghost Rider over the exact coordinates needed for successful mission completion. Below them, the Pacific Ocean concealed Naval Strike Group Alpha somewhere within the electronic interference zone that had trapped them for over 12 hours. Sarah couldn't see the ships that her mission was designed to rescue, but her navigation calculations confirmed that Ghost Rider was approaching the coordinates where electronic countermeasure deployment would create the electromagnetic disruption needed for fleet escape. Release point in 60 seconds, Sarah announced over the radio, beginning final preparations for payload delivery that would require split-second timing coordinated with fleet movements she couldn't observe directly. The weapons bay doors opened with mechanical precision, exposing the electronic countermeasure devices to airflow that created subtle changes in aircraft performance requiring immediate control adjustments. Sarah maintained precise heading and altitude while monitoring approach parameters that would determine whether the payload reached its intended coordinates. 30 seconds to release, she transmitted, watching analog instruments that showed Ghost Rider tracking toward the release point with accuracy that vindicated every hour of manual navigation training she'd completed during her civilian career. The release sequence activated automatically at the predetermined coordinates, ejecting electronic countermeasure devices that began their descent toward the ocean surface while activating systems designed to disrupt enemy electronic warfare. Across multiple frequency spectrums, Sarah felt Ghost Rider lighten as the payload separated, requiring immediate trim adjustments to maintain stable flight. Below them, electromagnetic interference that had trapped Naval Strike Group Alpha for 12 hours began dissipating as the countermeasure devices created disruption that gave American systems opportunity to restore normal operation. Sarah couldn't observe the results directly, but radio transmissions began appearing on frequencies that had been silent since the crisis began. Edwards Control, this is Ghost Rider, payload delivery complete, RTB at this time, Sarah transmitted, beginning the journey back to Edwards Air Force Base with the satisfaction that came from successful completion of the most important mission of her life. The flight home was conducted with the knowledge that her civilian qualifications had proven sufficient for military operations that exceeded anything she'd imagined when she first applied for Air Force pilot training. Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that expertise came in many forms, and that sometimes the most valuable skills were the ones that traditional institutions never thought to require. Ghost Rider touched down at Edwards Air Force Base as the sun set over the Mojave Desert, completing a mission that had transformed Sarah from rejected applicant to proven military aviator. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete technology had succeeded where the most advanced fighters had failed, piloted by someone whose qualifications had been judged inadequate for military service. In the Pacific, Naval Strike Group Alpha began restoring their systems and breaking free from the electronic warfare web that had threatened to destroy American naval power. 4,000 sailors owed their lives to a mission flown by someone who had been told she didn't belong in military aviation, using an aircraft that military planners had considered outdated until it became their only hope for salvation. Sarah Martinez had proven that quiet competence could overcome institutional barriers, that skills developed outside conventional frameworks could become essential when conventional approaches failed, and that sometimes the most important qualifications for extraordinary service were the ones that nobody thought to ask for until desperation made them essential. The mission was complete, the fleet was safe, and Sarah Martinez had earned her place in military aviation through performance rather than credentials, demonstrating that true expertise transcended institutional boundaries and that courage came in many forms, including the willingness to prove yourself when everyone else had already decided you weren't qualified to try. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.